So yes, our theme today is going to revolve around bridges, because as an entrepreneur, I think for those of you who are entrepreneurs, you found out that it can be really isolating because you only know your company, and especially in the period we're going through right now, I think Thibaut called it the worst downturn since the financial crisis. It can be even more isolating. But what I love about this panel is that everyone has a perspective on a lot more than one company. So either as investor or as talent partner or from the lawyer perspective, really have this insight on what's going on. And I think for founders, it's going to be also a helpful way to understand why maybe investors are not getting back to you or taking more time. And this way, you are going to understand what they are busy doing and what's happening behind the scenes, and how they are helping the companies they already invested in. So I want to actually start with that, because talking with Elena yesterday, we were talking about how it's not just the time you're spending with portfolio companies that has changed, but what you're doing with them and how you're supporting them.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as background, my role at Northzone is really focusing on supporting our portfolio companies with access to great talent and great operators. And what we were talking about yesterday is that, if we look back 2 years ago, there was a massive war on talent. It was all about hyperscaling, really getting A players in your team. Whereas now, I think VCs, and I'd love to hear everyone's views, are still spending a lot of time with the portfolio companies, but really the needs have changed. So it's more around, how do we focus on profitability? How can we connect our portfolio companies with amazing operators, like Thibaut that you just heard about, thinking through our go-to-market strategy, thinking through right-sizing the team, thinking through more sustainable hiring, rethinking expansion plans, and also, access to capital. So still a lot of time spent, but I would say much broader needs than just talent.
Yeah, and I think, Yvonne, you were telling me also about the time you're spending supporting portfolio companies in your company, and I think a term that struck me also, the ones that add more value, or you have a term for that? The companies you choose to spend more time with.
Yeah, so from our perspective, we've certainly been spending a lot more time with our portfolio companies, and a few key areas that we've been focusing on is for those that are slightly later stages, governance, for example, looking at their board, seeing if there's any gaps there. We've also been looking at ways in which we can help them leverage AI operationally, whether there's any cost savings that could be made there, and just seeing ways in which we could help them strategically. So that's something that we've been doing more proactively as well.
Mm-hmm. And Hussein, do you have any advice in terms of what companies should prioritize in terms of extending their runway right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think we heard this earlier with the Walt founder, is you need to survive in all of these times, which means that the single biggest priority, I think, for the CEO, who's almost always the founder, is just making sure the balance sheet is healthy. We as a firm, I think when the market changed about 1.5 years ago, made a very conscious decision to make sure all of our companies were as funded as possible, and a bunch of our companies are now funded until 2024, 2025. But not everyone did this, and I think if you're on the back foot, you've got to go figure out a way to be able to survive, and really the only levers you have is cut costs, take some cost out of the business, and make sure you raise some more money. And there's a ton of bridges and kind of behind the scenes financings that people aren't necessarily announcing, but they're doing it to make sure the company is as viable as possible. And if you could survive, you free up optionality, and hopefully you can grow and kind of live to fight another day.
Yeah, I was joking actually that those deals, as journalists, are the one we never hear about. We only hear about the seed plus rounds that everyone raising. But Jamie, you do see these deals, so I wanted your insights on more specifically how founders should balance between raising money and the terms they might be willing to accept, because terms have changed.
Yeah, it's like the favorite topic right now. Don't just accept money from anyone for the sake of it. But also on the extending runway piece and the kind of looking forward piece, sure. I think this is like the best time for companies to actually balance. For sure, if you need to do a small bridge or an ASA, totally understand that. But it's also the best time to get all of their ducks in a row for the next big round. The most time that I spend with a number of founders at the moment is thinking, can we make sure that your data room's properly up to the speed? it's all nice and neatly organized. Your incentives paperwork is all up to date. You're doing the right thing in terms of data, so that when they do get the opportunity for the big round, they're not caught on the back foot. So I think that's a really good investment of time as well, notwithstanding the fact that early stage bridge rounds, so there's still a lot of them. So yeah.
And then from your perspective, I think we talked about sustainable hiring. I was wondering how you advise companies to avoid facing layoffs if the situation happens again.
Yes, and I think, we've seen layoffs across companies. So to Hussein's point, is something that, depending on the company, might be something that companies need to do in order to survive. So it really depends on their situation, their runway. So I don't think there's a silver bullet in avoiding that. And I think that the reality is that a lot of companies across the ecosystem are going through this right now. I would say there's still some hiring going on. It's just on the plus side, it's a lot more thoughtful. Founders, I think, are spending a lot more time on what their org structure looks like, on what they really need, spending more time, meeting candidates, finding that the culture fit is right, than if you say a few years ago. So yeah, we're seeing this sort of mixed environment of layoffs on the one hand, but also some sustainable hiring going on.
And in terms of being prepared for the next stage, I think you mentioned how companies need support with governance and also maybe M&A preparation. How's that happening?
Yeah, so I guess for companies that are within our portfolio that are in the fortunate position to have quite an ample cash position, one of the areas that we've been looking at is ways in which they could potentially acquire businesses in this current environment. Given that pricing is a lot more favorable than what we've seen in the previous years. So that's an area that anything from helping them build a pipeline and so on of potential targets is something that we've been spending a lot of time on.
Yeah, because M&A, as a founder, it's also a way to give, if you're the acquired company, it's a way to give continuity to your team and make sure they have a good home. And Elena, I think your companies, the fact that you have a portfolio, again, it means that the founders are not isolated, and as an employee, it might mean that you could work for another portfolio company potentially.
Yeah, and I think this is where I think VCs have a great role to play here, and it's great to see that the ecosystem is, growing in terms of operating partners, platform roles, talent roles, because what we're really seeing now is that there's this outflux of amazing talent from some of the bigger tech companies that would be happy to, go work for earlier stage companies, and similarly within portfolio companies, to the extent that we can make these connections. Not just within the Northzone portfolio, but also with co-investors. I think there's more of a movement to try and do this, and I think from a founder's perspective, it's also really great because suddenly you can have access to people that you wouldn't be able to have before.
I see you agreeing.
Yeah.
What are you seeing on that front in terms of?
On the employment side, the really exciting piece I see on that. Access talent is huge, but also the way that companies are hiring now is really interesting. So obviously coming out of COVID, like fully virtual companies now, that comes with its own risks and interests, especially on the expansion side, we're seeing a huge number of companies, do they really need a subsidiary? Yes, is the answer a lot of the time. How they use employers of record and the kind of risks and rewards that come with that. So it's an exciting space, but lots of opportunities coming out of that too.
And Hussein, as an American in London, I was wondering if you see any difference in how the downturn is being felt on both sides.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, the European market tends to lag the American market. So people went into we need to save these companies like 6 months ahead of Europe, in the US, and people were kind of business as usual in Europe. I think sentiment has now changed in America. There are more deals being done, and the volumes are picking up. I think, again, Europe is a little bit out of date or out of sequence with America. So that's probably not going to really happen in Europe for another few more months. And then on these bridge rounds and cobbling together financings to keep companies alive, and often it's non-traditional venture. It's not like the Series A, Series B investor, right? It's smaller venture funds. It might be a family office. It might be an entrepreneur who has wealth. I have found if you take the same company and shop it in Europe, you're likely to be turned down. I just don't think of Europe as like a growth mindset kind of economy. And you shop it with the same set of characters in the US, and the round gets done like almost immediately. So, you know, our view as Hoxton is, look, you can start a business in Europe, you should scale the business as much as possible in Europe, but you should really focus on the American market, both from a traction perspective and from a financing perspective, because I think if you can hit the bar in the US, you kind of definitively hit the bar in Europe. And in these times, I think you can hit the bar in the US and you fail to hit the bar in Europe, but that's actually an okay thing, because the Americans are much more open-minded about risk.
And Jamie, where do you see the main gaps right now in terms of funding? What stage has slowed down the most for you? From what I'm hearing, it's late stage, but...
Yeah, I still have a good number of late-stage companies that are raising, but obviously, if you're trying to raise 250 million plus, you've got to have some pretty good conviction. That ties quite nicely into your UK-US piece as well. Actually, the big pain point that I see at the moment, I counsel hundreds of folks that are trying to bridge that UK-US divide, and whether or not it makes sense to do a flip. That can be quite painful if they're trying to access US capital. There is a whole load of what I would say early stage seed companies available at the moment. Reminds me of when I first started about 15 years ago, and you had to speak to thousands of companies, and they were all, a lot of them doing some of the same things. So trying to find that separation amongst the companies, which ones stand out, is quite interesting. But yeah, it's the later stage that naturally takes the hit in these times, for sure.
Do you have any opinion in the... sorry, I'm thinking. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think that the gap at the later stages is something that's always been a challenge within Europe, and there's a number of conversations and strategic initiatives taking place within government and so on. But I think it's going to be some time before that gap's filled. And so, to your point earlier, the US is absolutely key, and building those ties to the US sooner rather than later is going to be key for any company that's planning to scale.
Yeah, and in terms of the prediction that things are going to take a few more months to pick up in Europe compared to the US, is that what you were seeing as well, Jamie?
I'd love to know the VC opinion on this one. It's quite great. I swear every VC I speak to has a different opinion. You know, we typically work on, there are cycles within the year, so the life of a corporate lawyer before Christmas is generally horrible. The expectation is that summer is quiet because people go on holiday. But actually, most people I'm speaking to now are thinking that sort of August, September time is going to have a rush. I'd say, we're probably about 50% down so far this year in terms of the companies that are executing deals at the moment. So there's a lot of room to go up. The venture debt guys are just always busy, it seems. Everyone I speak to now is just, yep, we haven't stopped. But I'd love to hear from you guys when you think you
yeah,
start
Elena, is summer a quiet period at Northzone? Or
Yeah, I mean, I just to quote some of our investment partners, we always say we're not macroeconomists, so who knows what's going to happen, the big picture, and how long the whole downturn is going to take. But I think in terms of our investment team, we're always, on the hunt for amazing founders, always trying to meet as many companies as possible, and then adding to that the portfolio turbulence at the moment means that it will probably be a busy summer, bar a few Nordic holidays here and there.
I'm probably a little bit more skeptical. So I think, I was in the dot-com bubble. I was on the other side, not investing, but building companies. And this feels a lot to me like that period from like 2001 to 2005. And there are exceptions, like the generative AI boom right now, which is like its own little mini bubble in many ways. Like I think the rules don't apply. Everything that I say doesn't apply to that, because I think that industry is kind of up and to the right. And I'm like deeply optimistic about like the future of technology. I think like especially with AI, it feels like where we were with the personal computer in the 80s, and I think it's going to make like transformative changes in the economy. But having lived through that 01 to 05 cycle, like things were slow. And I feel like the big open question mark is there are a whole bunch of companies that got themselves out of Dodge and can survive until 2024. But there's a whole bunch of other companies that have been delaying, but they can only delay so much. and they're going to have to go back into the market to go raise money in 2023. And it's probably going to be the second half. I don't think it's going to be pretty. I think a bunch of these, and what I'm hearing from the Valley is a lot of CFOs, particularly of later stage companies, are doing everything in their power to avoid an equity financing. So they're doing these crazy structured debt financings. This is the kind of stuff that blows up I mean, we live through this. It's take the medicine. It's a pain in the butt, but take it, move on. Focus on your fundamentals. But this is an industry that sometimes doesn't focus on fundamentals, and you get these things that just cascade into a myriad of problems. And I feel like we're causing more problems, so it's going to be another 2 to 3 years before we're kind of fully out of this. So I'm sadly the pessimist around the room.
I think I'm with you on that. I think from our perspective, what we've been telling our companies that are currently raising is if you can raise for 36 months, because we don't have a crystal ball. We don't see this situation getting any better anytime soon in terms of the current environment. And so just to have that contingency. But also it's about striking the balance, right? Because we have also seen companies that do have really long runways, almost taking their foot off the pedal. So it's really about striking that balance. But I think for the foreseeable future, I don't see it being positive anytime soon, unfortunately.
Sorry to end on that pessimistic note. We need to wrap up, but I hope you realize that, talking to people who've been in the market for quite a while also give you that perspective, not only on multiple companies, but also on the comparison with what happened around the dot-com boom. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.